Keith Cottier here, giving the first of two AJ+C design history talks. In this talk I'm going to talk a little about my early years in architecture and the things that influenced me in the way I thought about architecture. I decided rather late to become an architect. I'd been pressured by various family members to be an architect, mainly because I did a lot of drawing, I think, but I was sort of heading more for science in those days and really made a last-minute decision to do architecture. I enrolled in the Sydney Technical College, which later became the University of Technology and later still became the University of New South Wales. It was a part-time course, and I found my first job with a firm of Sydney architects called Foyle, Mansfield and McClurkin, who were probably in the first sort of top 6 biggest firms in Sydney, and they had an office at North Sydney. I've never had much of a memory for figures, but I've always remembered my starting salary of £3, 5 and 6. There were 3 standout influences in that office. The first was Joe Foyle, senior partner, who had a few Silverman Awards under his belt and had designed many of Sydney's better Catholic churches. If you've not done it before, pop into St Anne's at Bondi or St Mary's at North Sydney. The interiors are well worth a look. Joe also designed the liturgical furniture, tabernacles, candelabras, etc., and used to do amazing full-size detailed drawings of them. Plan, section and elevation all on the one drawing, overlaid, using a seriously blunt 6B pencil. He would then colour the print with a mixture of watercolour, never mixed in a clean palette, dropped cigarette ash and spilled coffee. Up close these drawings were indecipherable, but if you pinned them on a wall and viewed them from a range of about 20 metres, which Joe always did on completion, they were something else, full of great beauty and sensuous line. Joe's drawings made mine a little more adventurous. Oz Jarvis was another partner, a construction man, who produced full-size freehand joinery details without the use of a scale, but notating them out of 5x1, etc. I secretly checked them as I organised the prints, but never caught him out. The accuracy was amazing. I lusted after this ability and practised incessantly. Jim Kell was at that time not a partner, but seemed to do nearly all the good work. He went to the site first thing, would arrive in the office around 10, take a telephone call before he'd taken his hat off, and the hat would often stay on his head all morning. The phone hooked to his ear constantly, but the T-square travelling up and down the board, a drawing by lunchtime. Jim's ability has never been well recognised, I feel. St Paul's College Chapel at Sydney University is one of his buildings, which I think is well worth a look at. He always had time to discuss my latest design project and give constructive advice. He taught me to be patient, that I didn't have to put every one of my great ideas into the current project, a lesson we all have to learn, although some people never ever really learn it. In the first weeks at university, my first design tutor, Derek Wrigley, stunned me by making us match up pictures of different breeds of dog with different pieces of famous furniture, a bulldog with a Chesterfield sofa, for example. This sort of association made a big impression on me. I started to look more closely at what I saw, and I matched all sorts of things to dog breeds, including my relations. I still often ask myself, have I got the right dog here? At university, the wonderful Miles Dunphy tried to teach us the history of architecture using the Bannister-Fletcher comparative method, where size definitely mattered and beauty seemed a secondary consideration. Confirmed modernists already, we weren't much interested in this ancient world and often preferred the Kingsford snooker parlour to the history. But Miles took me on my first serious bushwalk, along with Paddy Cullen, whose name meant nothing to me then. And Miles taught me to see my country and its vegetation in a completely different way. Despite the fact that most of the students were part-time, student life was busy and exciting, with a particularly active architectural student club that organised exhibitions and seemingly endless parties and adopted the Hero of Waterloo pub in the Rocks. The disruption of WW2 in the lives of many meant that there was a wider than normal age group among the students. Some of these people were a great source of knowledge. Bob Meyer was one, on the left here. He had already been to Europe several times, riding motorcycles on the Cinders tracks, and seemed incredibly experienced and sophisticated, a source of great enlightenment. He taught us about the Bauhaus and Corbusier, the recent architectural history, and his enthusiasm for architecture was, and still is, quite infectious. On the right is Col James, who taught for many years later at Sydney University. Col actually made sure we all had a great social life. In Melbourne for the Olympic Games, I saw Wilson Hall at Melbourne University, Bates Smart and McCutcheon design. The first building that I had seen that seemed to me both modern, civic and elegant. Foyle Mansfield was a very professional office, but rather conservative. I learnt there the art of traditional joinery, architraves, rebates, Bollection moulds and astragal meeting styles. I coloured the tender sets of working drawings and did the odd detail. But office boys often remain office boys for a long time, and I decided it was time to move to a smaller office where I might get more experience. At the office of John Allen and Russell Jack, there was only one other architectural staff member. I knew nothing of their work, but responding to an advertisement in the Herald, I was given the job there, and soon after I started, Russell won the Sulman for his house, and I did the presentation drawing for the mags. The house was a revelation to me, not an architrave or cornice in sight, every detail designed to accentuate the concept of the house. There was even a hint of romanticism here, and the profession was agog with the decadence of that arch. Postmodernism was still a long way away. I was undecided about it, too hard. My move was a great success. Russell and John threw more and more at me. I did the working drawings for a series of Russell houses. Wonderful experience within the comfort of someone else's palette. And John and Russell were obviously a big influence on me. At university there were three camps, Corbusier, Wright and Mies, still battling it out. But Peter Collar had arrived to put a little intellectual rigour into our work, and we put some critical analysis into his. This is one of his houses in Middle Cove. The architectural world in Sydney was jumping at this time, great work being done, and I started to meet the participants. Peter Muller's Whale Beach house blew me away, as did Bill and Ruth Lucas's house in the trees, the nearest thing a suburban lad could imagine as a heavenly place in which to live. Brian Maslin and Glenn Murcutt were both soon working at the office and furthering the debate. Glenn in his right phase at this stage. We all experimented being different dogs. I visited his family, as I mentioned at his Prisca dinner, and found a household from another world, with his partly built yacht still on the floor of the living room, piles of old magazines yellowing on the shelves, and his butterpaper sketches stuffed under the lid of one of several grand pianos. This was a big jolt, right in front of my nose, more diversity in the world than I had ever imagined. I threw all my student work out many years ago. It was not worth the shelf space, I thought. But when he wrote a book on AJ+C's work, Trevor Howes tracked down a couple of things that had been published. And here they are, promise not to laugh. Russell was very critical at the time of this cast iron railing on the balcony of a modern house. This building, an addition behind the Registrar General's building near Hyde Park Barracks, had a big influence on my life. I did all the documents for its construction with a lot of overtime, and it paid for my fare to Europe. Like so many in those days, I was feeling the isolation of Australia from the rest of the world. After 6 long years, I was about to graduate, but had to admit to myself that I felt quite scared at the prospect of being asked to design a building all by myself. I hadn't even reached a view on the Corb-Wright-Mies dilemma. On the other hand, I was ready to take on the world. And when I left, I didn't intend to return, although I told no one about that. I went by ship, of course, that was the cheap way, with Robert Bruce and Graham Smart, 2 fellow students. Over the next 3 years, we lived and talked architecture non-stop. We have remained close friends ever since and have been important influences on one another's work. Robert later worked for SOM in San Francisco for 10 years, before returning to become design partner in Bates Smart's Melbourne office. Graham worked in Italy for some years, then worked in London at Arab Associates during their heyday. It was a Greek ship, of course, and it arrived in Piraeus as the setting sun highlighted the Parthenon. This is not the photo of that moment. The next day, I was buoyed by the excitement of this place, by new smells and sounds, but surprised that this ancient place just didn't feel as old as part of some of the land that I'd stepped on in Australia. In London for a few weeks, we were soon back onto the continent, and with youthful confidence, we drove into Paris at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, a wet night, and found a little hotel in which to stay. On our first morning there, we were awakened by great activity in the street below. Shut-down street of the previous night had become a real French market. In the street, Rue de Seine, more than in Athens or in London, I felt part of Europe, in the midst of an exciting urban life. I also found in Paris my favourite room in the world, the reading room at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Unfortunately, one can't get entrance to this room any longer, or photograph it, but it is the most exciting place. Afterwards, I was stunned by the opulence and decadence of Versailles. Towards the end of my course, I could occasionally afford to buy the latest edition of the magazine Domus. Only a few of these super glossies arrived in Sydney, by ship of course, and the possession of the latest issue was a real status symbol. From these publications we learnt of the Italians, Ernesto Rogers and BBPR, Gardella, Albini and the young Scarpa. I now saw their buildings, the real thing. I loved their gallery work, but the new work often seemed over-complex, overburdened by their past. At this time, most of Corbusier's work was still a post-war wreck, and Ronchamp had been published in such detail that there were no surprises, except perhaps that it was much smaller than I had imagined. One of the great other joys in this period was the time to read at last, and Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet consumed me. In it, 4 different people, 4 very exotic people, tell their story of the same series of events, and the difference in how they see and interpret things is quite staggering, yet believable. Now it seemed even the truth was unreliable. Ever since, I have been aware of the need to consider how other people might see things from their own different point of view. Back in London after 4 months on the road, there was no money left, so I took the job that paid the most with a commercial firm called Ian Fraser & Associates, whose office was close to Covent Garden. To understand London's greatness, one really has to work there, I think. Its beauty is not laid out for one, as it is in Paris, for example. There are just too many influences from London for me to list, but I couldn't leave out the Soane Museum, which I visited over and over and still do whenever I go to London. The creative mind rampant, and architect's treat, lessons aplenty here. The next summer off to Scandinavia, but on the way 2 surprise treats. Ballage's Corn Exchange, a wonderful brick exercise, and Dudoc's Hilversum Town Hall and offices. Russell Jack had told me about this building, but I hadn't been prepared for its consistent beauty. And it was the most beautifully built modern building I'd ever seen. In Sweden, another library to impress. I'm a sucker always for a wall of books. And then an unexpected, unknown knockout. This beautiful crematorium chapel in Gävle in Sweden, designed by a group of young architects, the result of a competition. Serenely simple, beautifully detailed, this building gave me a real charge, but also a pang of inadequacy. These fellows were my age. I'd be more than happy to have done this building last year, let alone in 1962. Later on in Finland, the goodies kept coming. And then the Alto Feast. Suddenly I found buildings that sat so comfortably in their context. They always seemed to belong. They possessed a human quality, devoid of the harshness that I'd seen so often. But what was really the biggest influence in Finland were the dozens of good, simple, modest, modern buildings to be seen wherever you went. Finland was not a wealthy country. It could only afford to build with the materials it produced: timber, fibre cement, bricks and copper. This limited palette seemed to be a huge advantage rather than disadvantage, and I remember making a mental note that when I did eventually build something, it would be very wise to work within the confines of a similarly limited palette. In Spain later in the year, I found the bay windows of Salamanca more glassy than any modern building, and started a long fascination with painted architecture, starting to see colour as a design tool and not a problem. Back in London again, and Glenn was now working in the same office. We both gravitated to a work cell run by one of the Ian Fraser partners, Bob Patterson, working on major redevelopment schemes around the country. Bob was an impressive thinker and talker, and always built his work up from a strong, simple concept. Glenn and I were both influenced by Bob and have fond memories of our time there. But nothing ever really got built, and I don't know if Bob has ever built anything to this day, and I was now feeling at last ready to build. My last winter in London went on forever. No exciting snow, just cold, greyness, endlessly. I was realising that the bright young boys of architecture in England were in their 50s, and I was 24 and getting impatient. John and Russell had been in touch, tempting me with a nice project. On the way back from lunch one day, I saw a shaft of sunlight landing on the pavement across the road. A rare sight. I crossed over and stood in it, closing my eyes and imagining warmth and that feeling of catching a wave, surrounded by all the bubbling foam. But there was no heat at all in that shaft of sunlight, and I think it was at that moment that I decided to return to Oz. So my very first project was not the residential alts and ads for one's relative, but Club Hall at Friendship School in Mittagong. Friendship School was run by a wonderful woman called Winifred West, who was very much involved with the local community, not just the school. She was keen to use local materials, local tradesmen, and there was a brickworks barrel that had reopened recently. And so to go along with her wishes, partly, and partly to build a building that was strong and simple, limiting that palette, as I'd mentioned before, Club Hall became a brick building, bricks everywhere. It was designed as a multi-purpose building, but already Musica Viva had concerts at school every Easter, and so the hall was designed for chamber music very exclusively, and Musica Viva have continued to have concerts there. I designed everything and documented everything on this particular building, including the seats, the rollout 4-stage elements, the lighting, and the arrangement of the organ pipes. The second building that I did was a house at Paradise Beach. It's on a very steep side, a 45-degree slope, in amongst a whole stand of spotted gums, and the house is positioned at the bottom of this block of land with the road access at the top. So all the materials had to basically be carried down. So the house is actually made up of a series of flat sheets of fibre cement board and sticks, timber posts, timber cover battens, timber railings, timber flooring, and a roof of tiles. The framework for the house is set outside the walls of the house so that I'm actually repeating as much as possible the verticals of the trees. It's a simple plan on 3 levels, dropping down the hillside, the living room at the bottom and the big dormitory bedroom at the top, which is divided by a series of beams and curtains so that different combinations can be given privacy. The next project was the Clune Galleries, a complete internal fit-out of an 1830s building in Macquarie Street, which still stands there. These photographs were taken some years ago. There were 2 buildings here, and the one on the left at the time I did the one on the right was still a bit of a wreck. This was a building done for Frank McDonald, and I did several other buildings for him later on. This alteration of 2 terrace houses in Victoria Street, Potts Point, and later on the restoration of Bundanon on the Shoalhaven for Frank McDonald and McGraths. Later on was sold to Arthur Boyd and is part of the Bundanon complex. I fit out an internal kitchen for Margaret and Leon Fink in the 1970s, stainless steel benches, all white cupboards, gas hot plates set into the kitchen bench top. This was the first really shiny white kitchen in Sydney. And then the Rothbury Estate Winery. This photograph shows the first and second stage of the winery. Len Evans was part of a group of 11 or 12 quite wealthy people who started this winery. At that time there were no really smart wineries at all up in the Hunter. They were all a series of old galvanised iron sheds. Len was a great entrepreneur and wanted to have a winery where they could have great dinners and feasts. And so the production of the wine, the receiving of the grapes happens externally, here into crushers, then it goes into the building, and the big cask hall, the entertainment centre if you like, sits up above the messier production area. This is my perspective of the cask hall, and the red wine goes into these timber barrels and remains there for at least a year. So it was felt that we could move this storage aspect into the cask hall for atmosphere, put it onto 2 levels so that everybody is surrounded by the casks. Big shearers' sorting benches used as tables, and a big timber hardwood structure supporting the casks. The upper level with a walkway between the double row of barrels. And this is a rather blurry photograph of one of the great dinners that Len organised until he actually moved out of Rothbury at the end of the 80s, I think. So they are the early influences and the early projects of Keith Cottier and Alan Jack+Cottier.